Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy you're here to see the process of me making a layered background using Stencil Girl Products stencils. I often like to start out my journal spreads using high contrast collage materials. I created this one using these little letter stamps and an ink pad. I also sponged some black gesso through these stencils onto tissue paper to create some more high contrast material. This letter stamped paper is actually a printed copy from my inkjet printer that I left out overnight to cure so that when I glued it down into my journal, the ink would not run. The glue that I like to use to just glue down regular paper is a soft gel medium. Whereas when I'm gluing down tissue paper, I like to use a matte medium that is a little bit more liquid. I find that this just creates a better transparent type look with the tissue paper than a soft gel or even a glue stick. I like to start my journal pages with a high contrast layer, whether it's collage like this or marking up the page with a big giant black Sharpie. It gets me started and it creates a layer that gives the overall spread, once it's finished, a nice richness. For me, the next step in the process is to gather together the collage materials and other imagery that I'm going to use in the final stages of the journal spread. This makes it easier for me to pick and choose colors and images and materials to use in my background because I know that in the end it will all coordinate. For me, art journaling is about little choices that you make along the way, and this just makes it easier to make those choices. So I've chosen this imagery and I've cut everything out. I may or may not use everything that I've got here, but I'm putting together a plan of how it's going to go together. And these images set the tone for the color choices and mark making that I'm going to do in the rest of my background. So to start out, I'm just scribbling on some water-soluble crayons, a Distress crayon from Tim Holtz and a Stabilo Woody. And then over the scribbly crayons, I'm adding a layer of absorbent ground, which activates the water-soluble crayons as well as unifies the page with a cloudy coating of white, pushing back some of the more stark black and white imagery. With that absorbent ground in place, it has a gritty texture, so it's really taking this watercolor pencil well for some more scribbles. Now I'm adding some acrylic inks, and I like to add this color in kind of a wash. So I water it down and apply it with a watercolor brush, just kind of doing some translucent patches here that will stay in place. Because it's acrylic ink and not watercolor, it won't activate when I add other media to it later on. So I've got a light lime green down, and I'm going to be adding primary magenta and watering that down so it's a pretty pale wash. And continuing on, I'll add some fluorescent pink to that primary magenta and get a little bit of variation in color, and then finish it off with some flame orange. And all of these are going to be kind of diluted so that it's got that watercolor effect. And you'll see that I also blot up the flame orange at the end because it's pretty prominent, and I wanted to just knock it back a little bit so that it wasn't quite as bright. So there's a lot of color going on here now. It's pretty vibrant, and what I want to do is knock it back a little bit more, kind of creating that back and forth, layering on top of layering, and using this stencil. It's a Tracy Bautista deconstructed chrysanthemum from Stencil Girl Products. And so I'm just stenciling through with a sponge using some Paper Artsy fresco finish paint and nougat, and I knew that I was going to do this. I knew I was going to take all of that bright paint and then stencil over it or paint over it with a white to unify the pages and make it more of a background that's receptive to the next layers that are going to happen. With all the absorbent ground and the fresco finish paint, I have a pretty matte surface that will take additional media going forward pretty well. So first I'm adding, I think I added a black Prismacolor pencil and scribbled, and then I added some marks with an Inktense water-soluble pencil in dark aquamarine. And now I'm adding watercolor, and this is Dr. P.H. Martin's liquid watercolor in ice blue, and I'm using it to activate that Inktense pencil that was also a shade of blue, so it gives it a little more depth, I think. I'm also adding my all-time favorite watercolor from Dr. P.H. Martin's, which is Moss Rose. I think I have 2 bottles of this stuff because I don't want to run out ever. I just love it. So I'm doing some dripping, and I feel the third color that I'm adding of the Dr. P.H. Martin's is a warm brown. So it kind of gives a nice tonality to these other bright colors mixing together, and it's adding the color back in. So we took the color away and now I'm adding it back in. You can probably guess that the next step is, once we've added color, to take it away. So I'm trying to use a subtractive technique with a baby wipe through this Playful Bloom stencil by Ray Massigman from Stencil Girl Products. And I'm getting a little mottled effect. It's not a dramatic effect, but it is removing some of the color, so it's not quite as bright. And it's giving me some marks. They're subtle, but I like it, and it is kind of blending these big blotches of watercolor into the background a little bit. But it wasn't enough. I had to knock it back even more. So I'm adding some gesso, and what's good about the watercolor is that it will bleed through the layer of gesso that I'm putting on top of it, and it will still show through. It will just be a more subtle effect, and those big puddles or blotches will be less prominent, discrete blotches and blend more into the background. So I still get all the color, it's just a little more subtle. Now I still want to add more color, and I thought I would do that by using some pieces of these gel prints that I made using the Stencil Girl product stencils on my gel plate and some deli paper. And I'm looking through, comparing the colors in the prints to the colors in the items that I'm going to collage onto my final spread, and picking some out. And I decided that I would just cut out some shapes that are kind of reminiscent of petal shapes and the centers of the flowers that are already kind of appearing there in the background, and add these kind of color elements to the background this way. I love how there's some white striations from the stencils and the gel prints that will be translucent, and you can see the background that's underneath there shining through once they're all glued down. And since this is a tissue paper like collage material, I'm going to go back to using my matte medium, which is a little thinner glue, to put them down. And I'm pointing out those areas where you can kind of see through those pieces of the prints. I'm going to add some final scribbly marks using oil pastel, and this is kind of a rusty, burnt, raw umber color, and then I add a yellow oxide oil pastel scribble across there. I thought about adding black, but I decided against it, and instead I'm going to add some black marks and scribbles with that same Prismacolor colored pencil that I used earlier on, and create some scribbles and marks that give it more of a grungy look. And I'm outlining some of those cutout shapes with this black pencil as well. Now, because I used oil pastels in my spread, my habit is to cover those areas with either matte varnish, or in this case I chose to go with clear gesso because I think I wanted an extra gritty surface to be able to make marks on top of this. And I learned from my artist friend Bai Bun, otherwise known as Roxanne Coble, to cover your pastel with some type of varnish or coating if you want to make marks over your spread later on, because you won't be able to do that if you don't seal up the oil pastel. And here I am with my marks. I'm using this Stabilo Marksol in dark green to draw in some leaf shapes that I will activate with a wet brush and just complete the garden look of my background. And as I'm going through here brushing it, I realized I wanted to give the green a little more variation, so I'm adding the Stabilo Marksol in yellow to the leaves and then adding the water to the mix. With the background complete, it's time for me to glue down my focal image and collage elements. And in order to do that, I'm just kind of laying things out first. And as I had added the clear gesso, there was a little bit of a rough surface on the pages. So it was harder to glue, and I ended up using a glue stick right onto the page. So the tooth of the gesso took on my glue, and then I laid the pieces onto that and kind of picked up edges and applied more glue as I needed it to get everything stuck down the way I wanted. And now it's time to add some final details, and the tried and true way to get my collage elements and my focal point to stand out off of this very vibrant, kind of busy background is to use my Stabilo Marksol to outline all of the elements, and then with a watered brush blend that black pencil into the background, and that way things show up a little bit better. Now, I don't know why, but it just all of a sudden occurred to me that Led Zeppelin has said something about a girl with flowers in her hair, so I looked up the lyrics to the song Going to California, and I wrote them out onto just a piece of copy paper. I did it in pencil first and then went over it with a micron pen that's a permanent black ink. So because this is copy paper, I'm back to using my soft gel medium to glue this down, and I was careful not to get any of the medium on the top part of the message there because I knew I was going to use watercolor crayons to fill out the border and blend it into the page. So I'm choosing colors that I feel will match with what's in there, going around the edges, and of course I'll blend this in with a wet brush so that this white piece of paper really blends into the page. Even after applying all of my Neocolor 2s and blending the edges of this paper into my background, it was still standing out a little too much for me. So I added some India ink in magenta in splatters over the page, making sure to splatter the white paper, and that blended it back into the page a little bit more. In addition, I'm going to be outlining all or most of the lines of the magazine cutouts that I have here. And I really wanted to incorporate the Eye of Horus in this spread. I've been kind of thinking about the Eye of Horus since I had the surgery in 2018, and it's a symbol of protection, and I thought it would be cool to add that to this eye. Her eye didn't really stand out as well as maybe it would have if it were a different magazine image, but this really makes it stand out, and it adds an element, a mystical kind of element that I really like. I think this page is pretty much done. I added those butterflies. As you can see, they kind of overlap the lyrics on the white paper and areas, and then settle on some of the blooms here and there. You can see I've got all of my outlining done. So I thought I would just add some white dots to kind of give it some movement and then call it done. I hope you've enjoyed watching me create these journal pages. Thank you for visiting my channel, and I'll put some links to the Stencil Girl product stencils that I used to create my background in the description below.